I'm Kevin Davis. This is the Catholic Family Podcast, and I'm happy to be once again joined by Mr. Louie Verrecchio of akacatholic.com. Today, we're going to be talking about Dignitatis Humanae, and it's been a couple weeks since we've done our last show, and I think it's because part of it is because this is a doozy. And I think Louie was telling me before the show, this one took a bit to get into. There's a lot to cover, a lot to talk about, and it's going to need a little bit of special labor and a little bit of extra love for Dignitatis Humanae in trying to get to the truth of it and trying to get to, what it's all about, what it's trying to say, and what obviously we should be not taking from it, as well as what we should be taking from it. Because again, if anyone's been watching the series, of course, we're trying to show really the evils of Vatican II and the actual documents we've covered now. I think we've done 7 or 8 podcasts now. We have a couple more to come. And just trying to, again, do a deep dive into the actual documents. I highly recommend that if you haven't already seen this series, go back and check it out. There is a playlist on this very channel with the entire series. You don't have to watch them in order to watch this video. The introduction, that probably would help to get an idea of what was Vatican II, etc., but you don't have to watch that one. But I highly recommend to watch all of them and do that at the end of this video on Dignitatis Humanae. So, Louie, I guess, let's send it over to you. Where do we begin?
Well, normally we begin by jumping right into the conciliar text and then comparing and contrasting what the council is saying with what the church has always taught leading up to that point. But this time around, I want to begin the other way around with a brief overview of some very basic traditional Catholic concepts. And I think it's going to serve us well to do that. And I want to start with the matter of human rights, and in particular, those rights that belong to every human being, the innate rights, not ones that we earn, but ones that are innate to us simply by being created in God's image. All authentic human rights come from the God in whose image we're created, and all of these human rights are inextricably bound by their corresponding duties. In Catholic moral theology, rights and duties always go together. The freedom or the liberty that we have to exercise our human rights and the fulfillment of their accompanying duties is a function of justice. And that's to say, our duty to render unto others what is due to them. Now, there's a hierarchy of justice, and rendering unto God what he is due is the very first demand of justice. And it's not because God needs that from us, but rather because we need that as individuals, but also collectively, whether as a family, a society, or a state. We need to render unto God what he is due in order to attain to the end for which we were created, namely eternal life with him. Now, this means that our God-given freedoms are necessarily always ordered toward the good and the true. And so any supposed right to do evil, in other words, that which leads us directly away from our supernatural end, this is an abuse of true freedom. It's not an expression of true liberty. For example, nobody has the right to offend against the 10 Commandments. Nobody enjoys the so-called right to choose. Nobody enjoys the right to a same-sex marriage and so on.
Or just free speech, even, right? That's a whole other topic. But you have the right to good speech, but not to all speech.
Great point, especially for people that are watching that are living in the United States. I mean, we love our right to free speech. And you hear it even, politically on the left is attacking free speech. And you have people on the right, supposedly conservative Christians, demanding the right to free speech. Well, it's not an authentic right. I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, it ends up with pornography on X, right? On Twitter. Sure. It just shows you that's a perfect example of that doesn't make sense. How is that a right? So you're saying the right is, at least in the Constitution, is from God. And so that right somehow ends in pornography? No, sorry, guys. No, that's not how this works.
Yeah, good point. I'm glad you brought that up. So let's look more closely at authentic liberty. And I want to do that by considering the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII called Libertas, on the nature of human liberty. Starting with the very opening sentence, the Holy Father tells us this, quote, "Liberty, the highest of natural endowments, being the portion only of intellectual or rational natures, confers on man this dignity, namely, that he is in the hand of his counsel and has power over his actions," end quote. Now, let's unpack this, because you and I don't speak this way.
Right.
As a rule.
This
is a Holy Fatherly way of talking, right? So the Holy Father states that liberty is the highest of the natural endowments, and this is having power over his actions. And why does he call it the highest of the natural endowments? Well, it's because without liberty, we would neither be able to exercise our rights, nor would we be able to uphold our duties that accompany them. And first among them is our duties towards God, in which case we would utterly fail in the first demand of justice, right? Now, at this point, I want to repeat a quote that I've brought up a few different times in this series from Quas Primas of Pope Pius XI. And it goes like this, quote, "When once men recognize, both in private and in public life, that Christ is King, society will at last receive the great blessings of real liberty, well-ordered discipline, peace, and harmony." End quote. Well, what does the recognition of Christ as King entail? Well, it entails ordering not just our personal lives accordingly, but also our public affairs, meaning the way in which entire nations are governed. And this is nothing other than upholding the first demand of justice. Now, this is the only way to exercise authentic freedom. And the Holy Father is telling us that apart from this, there can be no real liberty. There can be no peace. There can be no harmony. Or put another way, apart from the recognition that Christ is King and rendering unto him what he is due, there can be no just public order. And I want to ask viewers to remember that phrase, just public order, because it's going to come back as we continue later. Now, I want you to notice as well that the Holy Father, Leo XIII, in the opening sentence of Libertas, states that liberty, the liberty that we've been discussing, it confers on man a certain dignity. The Declaration on Religious Freedom that we're examining today, as we're going to see, it proposes that man has a right to religious freedom, and the foundation of this liberty is human dignity itself. In other words, the Council is suggesting that man has dignity, therefore he enjoys liberty. Whereas in the opening sentence of Libertas, we get the sense that man has liberty, and it's this liberty that imparts to him a unique dignity. Now, this might initially sound like hair splitting, but even though we could argue that human dignity and natural liberty are reciprocal in some way, I would suggest that something gets lost when human dignity is presented as if it's primary, or when it's treated in such a way as to lead one to believe that human dignity is the cause of liberty. And two things in particular get lost when human dignity is presented in this way. Number one, we lose sight of the fact that human dignity is diminished when liberty is abused, when it's exercised in the pursuit of evil, even if only by mistake. When we choose to embrace that which is not truly good, that choice leads us away from the end for which we were created, obviously. And this necessarily wounds and diminishes human dignity. In Libertas, we're given to understand that authentic liberty, meaning that liberty that's exercised in service to our duties toward God, this gives rise to human dignity, right? We can even say that human dignity is increased in this life when we employ our liberty in such a way as to deepen our communion with God. And this is why we can say with absolute confidence that the human dignity of the Blessed Virgin Mary exceeded that of any other created being, right? Because of her unique and intimate union with God. Now, contrast this with, let's say, John Paul II, who often spoke as if human dignity is this static, unchanging condition. And I'm sure viewers recall very well recently the Dicastery for the Destruction of the Faith in Conciliar Rome under Louie Verrecchio took this idea to its logical and utterly erroneous end by stating, quote, "Every human person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in his or her very being, which prevails in and beyond every circumstance, state, or situation the person may ever encounter," end quote. Now, clearly that's false, right? And if this is true, then the dignity possessed by the Blessed Virgin was no different than our own? Well, obviously, nobody watching this believes that. So in short, when human dignity is treated as the foundation of human liberty, what gets lost in the mix here is Almighty God himself, the true source of every authentic human right and every authentic liberty that we might enjoy. Now, if in fact I'm not just nitpicking here, and the Council really is guilty of treating human dignity as if it's the cause of man's freedom, then we should find that its teaching on man's supposed right to religious liberty overshadows rather than underscores man's duty to render unto God what he is due. And so we'll find out as we go along if that's the case. Now, before we jump into the declaration itself, one might ask the question, how does man, in the exercise of true liberty, how does he know what is good and what is true, and therefore can choose to act accordingly? Well, in Libertas, Leo XIII tells us that man's natural liberty is governed by the natural law, which is also known as the eternal law, which is described as being the very reasoning of God. And it's engraved in every single human being, and it's discernible by human reason alone. The Holy Father tells us this, quote, "It is manifest that the eternal law of God is the sole standard and rule of human liberty, not only in each individual man, but also in the community and in civil society." And quote, now this is very important. The sole standard of human freedom as it pertains to civil society, that is, in the way in which the state exercises its governing authority, it's the eternal law of God. Now, the last thing I want to touch on before we jump into the Declaration on religious freedom, we need to speak about the divine law. We haven't touched on it yet. To recap briefly, human reason informs us as to what is good and what is not by the light of the natural law. Now, we have the liberty to exercise our will to choose what we discern to be good. Reason and will reside in the souls of every human person. But as the Holy Father notes, he says, quote, "Both of these faculties, reason and will, are imperfect. And so it's possible, as is often seen, that man's reason should err by proposing something which is not really good, but which only has the appearance of good, urging him that the will should choose accordingly." End quote. Now, I might point out here, and it's important, that the Holy Father is not speaking about those who know what is right, and they know what is good, and they know what is true, and yet they choose to do evil anyway. I think everybody watching this recognizes that that sort of behavior is an abuse of authentic liberty. But what the Holy Father is talking about here is the fact that even sincere men who are truly seeking the truth, they often err in their reasoning, and they determine that something is good when it really is not. And furthermore, he tells us that this happens often, right? It's a result of original sin. And so he goes on to say we need something more in order to have certainty that we're residing within the eternal law and that we're making a right conclusion about what is good and what is not. And the Holy Father puts it this way. Quote, he says, "Human liberty is such that it necessarily stands in need of light and strength to direct its actions to good and to restrain them from evil. Without this, the freedom of our will would be our ruin. First of all, there must be law. That is a fixed rule of teaching what is to be done and what is to be left undone." End quote. And this is where the divine law comes in. That is the law that comes to us by way of divine revelation. And its role in our lives is to further specify and define for us what is required in order to abide by the natural law and thus to enjoy authentic liberty. And to whom has Almighty God entrusted his revelation and his divine law? To safeguard it, to teach it, and to explain it to all men for all time? Well, obviously, it's the Holy Catholic Church. Now, with all of that background out of the way, and I know it's a lot, but I think it's going to serve us well moving forward. At this point, we can jump right into the declaration, unless you have a question or comment,
and just
Kevin.
the one thing I'd comment that it really strikes me every episode we record, two things. I mean, one that I say over and over is that you really see the fruits from Vatican II. You see it now, and I think that's, again, important to remember that what's happening now in Rome stems from this. But I think it's also equally important to see, you can just read from the previous popes. You just read from several previous popes, Leo XIII, Pius XI. You can just read from the works, and they directly contradict what was said at Vatican II. So I think that's really important here. Anyone watching this, really keep that in mind. I mean, this is not just, and as Louie will tell you too, this isn't just Louie just like, spitballing, here's our opinion on Vatican II, guys. By the way, we don't like it. No, this is trying to really point out that this is contradicting what was taught beforehand, and a lot of it's contradicting common sense, which you did a great job. Thank you for that intro. I think that was beautifully said and really well described to understand what it all means, so that we can now see, okay, that's the true way of thinking about it, and now we get to get into, well, what we are sure is not going to be the true way of thinking about anything. But thank you very much for that intro. I think that's very helpful. And again, everyone, please remember, these documents exist. You can go, you can go read them, listen to them, etc. Talk to a priest about them. I highly recommend it because you're going to see a lot of truth from true popes.
Absolutely. And you're going to be hard pressed after that examination, and hopefully at the end of, our episode today, not to conclude that this is a new religion coming out of the council. It's a new religion, different set of articles of faith. Now, in Article 1 of the Declaration, right out of the gate, the council says this, and it's kind of laughable at this point to say this again, but this council leaves untouched traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies toward the true religion and toward the one Church of Christ, end quote. Now, in previous episodes, we saw that every time the council pledges its loyalty to traditional Catholic teaching, it seems to be protesting too much, right? Because ultimately it ends up just deviating from it immediately. Well, spoiler alert, obviously that's what we're going to see here. Also in Article 1, we're told this, quote, "A sense of the dignity of the human person has been impressing itself more and more deeply on the consciousness of contemporary man, and the demand is increasingly made that men should act on their own judgment, enjoying and making use of a responsible freedom, not driven by coercion, but motivated by a sense of duty," end quote. Now, a couple of observations here. One regarding the idea that men should act on their own judgment. Well, recall what Leo XIII taught that we just spoke about. Man's reason can err. And in fact, it often errs in judging something to be good that is not really good. And what's more, this happens even when men are totally sincere and truly trying to serve God in truth. Now, this being so, can it really be said that man should act on his own judgment? No, of course not. He should, and indeed he's duty-bound to act on right judgment alone. And how does he obtain this? Well, by way of the eternal law, which is illuminated and explained by way of the divine law, of which the Catholic Church is the sole custodian and authoritative teacher. The council doesn't go there, though. It does not say this. The declaration continues, quote, "The demand is likewise made that constitutional limits should be set to the powers of government in order that there may be no encroachment on this rightful freedom of the person and of associations," end quote. Okay, but let's be very clear about the government's duty. Again, Pope Leo XIII, the eternal law of God is the sole standard and rule of human liberty in civil society. In other words, the powers of government are bound. They're bound by the eternal law, the same that's illuminated by the divine law. Leo XIII also stated that human liberty is such that man needs to be directed toward the good, and he also needs to be restrained from evil. This is the right function of the governing authority, those who establish and enforce civil laws. Again, with the eternal law of God being the sole standard to consider in how this power is exercised. Now, this means that although the council is pleased to join its voice to those who insist that there may be no encroachment by the state, such that men are restricted from acting on their own judgment, the truth is that the state at times has a responsibility to do this in an effort to restrain men from evil. That's their role, right? A defender of Vatican II, though, would be quick probably to point out and to highlight this phrase, rightful freedom. And the council did well, they would say, to say that the state cannot encroach on rightful freedom. Well, there's some truth to that. And yet one notes that the council did not bother to define what rightful freedom is, which as it concerns religious freedom, the church has always taught that this pertains to Catholic worship alone. But the council doesn't go there. Not only did the council fail to teach this, as we're about to see, it actually goes on to contradict it. The council continues, it states, quote, "This demand for freedom in human society regards in the first place the free exercise of religion in society. This Vatican Council takes careful note of these desires in the minds of men," end quote. I think we have to give the council some credit here because it's making no bones about it. The issue at hand, as far as the council is concerned, is man's desire, right? It's not the reasoning. It's not the will of God. It's the desires that exist in the minds of men. And we have to be clear when we read it, the council say this Vatican Council takes careful note. Given the utter absence of any condemnation or attempt to clarify things in the light of Catholic teaching, it's very clear that the council is approving of the demands that are being made by men, right? And note what's demanded: the free exercise of religion in society. And so the question that has to be asked is, exactly what religion are they talking about? In the conciliar church, we know it's been our experience for decades now. All of the various religions are imagined to be good, all of them. I mean, Pope Benedict XVI, for example, who's widely considered to be the most traditional of all the post-conciliar claimants to the papacy, he stated, quote, "In a global society composed of many peoples and of various religions, the common good and the integral development are only achieved with the input of all this. Religions are crucial." Now, that's just not true. All of the religions, the various religions, they don't serve the common good and the true development of humankind. No, only one religion does that, and that's the Catholic religion. And then Francis, as is very well known, he even went so far as to say that, quote, "all religions are paths to God," right? Now, clearly, these are not Catholic ideas, but we have to acknowledge that these ideas are rooted very much in the Council's treatment of religious liberty, which speaks as if God grants to man the right to practice just any religion whatsoever. So, these post-conciliar claimants to the papacy, they weren't making things up. They were just building upon the foundation that was set at Vatican Council II. The declaration goes on, quote, "The Council professes its belief that God himself has made known to mankind the way in which men are to serve him, and thus to be saved in Christ and come to blessedness. We believe that this one true religion subsists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church," end quote. So once again, we see the subsistent novelty rearing its ugly head, and that's bad enough. It keeps coming up. But what I really want you to note is the affirmation that the Council puts forth when they state, "God himself has made known to mankind the way in which men are to serve him." Now, this is absolutely true. But then the Council goes on to state, quote, "Religious freedom in turn, which men demand as necessary to fulfill their duty to worship God, has to do with immunity from coercion in civil society." Now, at this, I want to consider these two concepts a little bit more closely. The Council approvingly cites man's demand for religious freedom, right? In other words, it frames this demand for religious freedom as a right, and it presents this right in relation to man's duty to worship God. But note, however, that it's one thing to speak of a duty to worship God, but it's another to address what that duty entails. Mm-hmm. Now, if the Council really is leaving untouched the traditional doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies toward the true religion, as it claimed, it would make clear that any authentic right to religious freedom is limited to that which is exercised by the members of the one true Church of Christ, the Holy Catholic Church. And why is that? Well, simply because this is what God himself has made known to mankind regarding the way in which men are to serve him. It's very simple, but we all know the Council doesn't do this. Rather, the Council has in mind a supposed right to practice any religion whatsoever, including those that directly oppose what God has made known, right? Now, let's take more closely a look at this idea as we just read. Quote, "Religious freedom has to do with immunity from coercion in civil society." In Article 2, the Council gets a little bit more explicit. It states this, quote, "This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits," end quote. I know that it's a mouthful, but we're going to pull it apart. Keep in mind, when the Council mentions any human power, it is very specifically talking about the governing power of the state and its ability to regulate the activities of the various religions, even in public. Notice, however, that while the Council is discussing the state's regulation of public religious activity, it chose to use the word coercion as opposed to regulation. And in fact, this is not a very long document. If you look it up, I can't recall the number of words involved, but it's pretty short. This word coercion appears in the text no less than 12 times. Now, motives are difficult to discern, but I tend to think that this choice of wording was more of a deliberate attempt on the part of the progressive bishops to elicit an emotional reaction in favor of unbridled religious freedom. It was more this than anything else. And unfortunately, if that was the case, it seems to have worked really well, because many defenders of the council, they seem to assume that until Vatican II came along, the church approved of the state coercing citizens to accept the true faith.
Good point.
Right? You've probably gotten that sense from talking to defenders of the council, but it's patently false. I mean, if turning once again to Pope Leo XIII on this point, and in this case, he's writing in the encyclical Immortale Dei, he says, quote, "The church is wont to take earnest heed that no one shall be forced to embrace the Catholic faith against his will. For, as St. Augustine wisely reminds us, man cannot believe otherwise than of his own will," end quote. So the idea that man can't be coerced to accept the Catholic faith, I mean, it's not even an idea originating with Leo XIII. He cites St. Augustine. This is something the church has always said and always held and insisted upon. And it's important to recognize that when you're reading Dignitatis Humanae, you keep seeing these references to coercion, because the emotional response is, yeah, they're right, there can't be coercion. Well, what the council is really talking about is regulation, but they're using that word coercion to elicit exactly that kind of response. All that made clear, when the declaration states that men are to be considered immune from coercion and never to be forced to act in a manner contrary to their own beliefs, the council does not say that this immunity from the state's power in matters religious is absolute, right? Remember what they said. It says that this immunity exists only within due limits, right? Now, based on what we've said so far, I think it's rather obvious who, according to the council's treatment, gets to determine when certain limits are due. Is it the church? Well, no, the council asserts no such right for itself. So that leaves just one choice. It's the state. The state gets to determine what due limits are, right? Now, here in the United States and much of the rest of the world, that means that the ruling elite, the wealthy, godless billionaire class, some of which are the adversaries to all men, who are ethnic supremacists, who are driving much of world affairs, that's who gets to set so-called due limits on religious activities. And it's not coming out of nowhere. The Second Vatican Council literally handed this to them, right? Now, missing entirely from this declaration, obviously, is any insistence that the Holy Catholic Church, insofar as she's been established by Christ the King and given a mission by him, is uniquely immune from the power of the state. But this is the traditional doctrine. So, I mean, we might conclude that when the council claimed that it would leave the traditional doctrine untouched, what it really meant to say is that it wouldn't touch the traditional doctrine with a 10-foot pole, right? As Leo XIII stated in his apostolic letter, Officio Sanctissimo, quote, "Of the rights of the church, that it is our duty everywhere and always to maintain and defend against all injustice, the first is certainly that of enjoying the full freedom of action she may need in working for the salvation of souls," end quote. The Holy Father went on to call this freedom of the Catholic Church, quote, "a divine liberty." In other words, it's given to her by God. And what's more, it's unique to the Catholic Church. The Holy Father goes on to say that the Church is, quote, "a society eminently independent and above all others, because of the excellence of the heavenly and immortal blessings towards which it tends," end quote. So in other words, in traditional Catholic teaching, the same that the council said it's not going to touch, there are no due limits to the Catholic Church's immunity from the power of the state insofar as her God-given mission is concerned. But the council doesn't dare insist upon the church's eminent independence. And why not? Well, collectively, for one, there's no indication that the council as a body actually believes it. And moreover, it wouldn't be very ecumenical for the council to make that claim, would it? So it might offend the Protestant observers, so they don't touch it. They won't go anywhere near that. And so with all of that said, when the government presumes to have the authority to insist that Catholic apostolates facilitate adoptions to gay couples, for example, or that its institutions have to provide insurance coverage for contraceptives, or that it has to lock the doors to its churches because of some alleged health crisis, we have to understand that this is something that arises right out of Vatican Council II. This is where the state got the idea that it has the right to set due limits even on the Catholic Church, right? They didn't presume to take that authority on their own. The Second Vatican Council essentially handed it to them. But this is just one side of the two-edged sword. The other edge is that the state, according to the council, those undefined due limits aside, the state must not hinder the practice of any religion. And this is important whether privately or publicly. And what this means is that the Muslims have the religious freedom, according to the conciliar church, to openly preach against infidels. The Jews have every right to proclaim Talmudic blasphemies against Christ. And Satanists have a right to literally worship the devil, and all of them have the right to urge others to join them, right? Does anyone really believe, just as a matter of common sense, like you said, Kevin, some of this is just basic common sense. Does anybody really believe that God grants such liberties to man?
Right.
Of course not. I mean, it runs counter to just common sense. But in the council's view, for the state to prevent these persons from publicly professing what they consider to be religious truth, and again, let's acknowledge many, if not most of the people who believe these false religions are sincere in their beliefs. For the state to encroach upon their public expression, this would be coercing these persons to act in a manner contrary to their beliefs. And in the council's view, this would amount to an assault on their religious freedom. So what does the traditional doctrine have to say about the idea that man has the right to freely profess whatever religion he happens to believe to be true? Well, looking once again to Pope Leo XIII and his encyclical Libertas, the Holy Father condemns, quote, that liberty in individuals which is so opposed to the virtue of religion, namely, the liberty of worship, as it is called, which is based on the principle that every man is free to profess as he may choose any religion or none at all, end quote. And in saying this, Pope Leo XIII is just echoing his predecessor, Pope Pius IX, who condemned in the Syllabus of Errors the false notion that, quote, every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true, end quote. Pope Leo XIII goes on to say about this false brand of religious liberty, quote, this kind of liberty, if considered in relation to the state, clearly implies that there is no reason why this state should offer any homage to God or should desire any public recognition of him, that no one form of worship is to be preferred to another, but that all stand on an equal footing, end quote. Well, this is exactly what the council is doing. It's urging the state to treat every religion the same, as if all of them stand on an equal footing. Pope Leo XIII goes on, however, quote, but to justify this, that is, governing as if no one form of worship is to be preferred to another, it must needs be taken as true that the state has no duties towards God, or that such duties, if they do exist, can be abandoned with impunity, both of which assertions are manifestly false. Now, remember, upholding our individual and collective duties toward God, this is the first demand of justice, and apart from this, there can be no just public order, no true peace, no true liberty. So neglecting these duties as it pertains to religion, however, this is precisely where Dignitatis Humanae leads. It's forging a path for exactly this. What the Holy Fathers of tradition are condemning is the gravely erroneous notion that the state should be ambivalent toward religion.
As you say, it kind of makes sense that America, which was not founded on Catholic principles, is not a Catholic country. That's how they act. It's kind of like, yeah, okay, you're free to do whatever, based on whatever you want. It is, the religious freedom, which is wrong. But isn't it amazing to be the actual true religion, or supposedly so, and then saying the same thing? And again, just logically, just how does this make any sense? I mean, like, as a government, okay, like, it's wrong, but I get it. Like, I understand it. It's certainly against Christ and the kingship of Christ, but yeah, okay, they were Freemasons. Okay, I understand it. But to do this from a document from the Vatican, I mean, wake up, people. I mean, it's crazy.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's one thing for these, revolutionaries who established the United States to say this, but these guys are supposedly acting as the supreme magisterium of the Holy Catholic Church.
Revolutionaries, though, right? The revolutionaries too.
Absolutely.
Well said. Yeah.
Right. Totally unfaithful, and they're creating the foundation for a brand new religion. It's obviously not Catholic. They're leading the state toward the idea that they must make no distinction at all between what is true and what is false in the matter of religion, which clearly implies there's no obligation on the state's part toward God. You couldn't come up with a less Catholic way of talking about the state's duty towards the Creator, who sustains the state in existence just as much as he sustains our existence as individuals. Putting all of this another way, what the council is doing, it's encouraging the separation of church and state. That's precisely what is happening here. And on this note, we do well to consider what Pope St. Pius X taught in his encyclical Vehementer Nos. He states this, quote, that the state must be separated from the church is a thesis absolutely false, a most pernicious error, based as it is on the principle that the state must not recognize any religious cult. Unquote. Now, this, of course, is exactly the U.S. constitutional approach, and it's the one that was adopted by the council. And this, in large part, thanks to the efforts of an American Jesuit by the name of John Courtney Murray. And we could spend several episodes just talking about his shenanigans and the reasoning that he put forth for making this happen. But we'll save that for another day. The Holy Father Pius X, though, is very clear that it's a grave error. And he explains exactly why, saying this, quote, it is in the first place guilty of a great injustice to God. For the creator of man is also the founder of human societies, and it is he who preserves their existence as he preserves our own. We owe him, therefore, not only a private cult, but a public and social worship to honor him. Besides, this thesis is an obvious negation of the supernatural order. End quote. And this teaching is perfectly in line with what Leo XIII taught 2 decades earlier in Immortale Dei. He wrote this, quote, so too is it a sin for the state not to have care for religion as something beyond its scope, or as of no practical benefit, or out of many forms of religion to adopt that one which chimes in with the fancy. For we are bound absolutely to worship God in that way which he has shown to be his will. End quote. Now recall that the council plainly admitted this, that God himself has made known to mankind the way in which men are to serve him. But the council does not do as the holy popes did before the council and have continuously done. And namely, that's to insist that not just individual men, but rather every human society and even entire states are duty bound absolutely to worship him in truth in the way that he has revealed. They don't do this. Why? Well, because this document's not Catholic. And if it was Catholic, it most certainly would repeat what Pius XI taught in Mortalium Animos. Quote, the Catholic Church is alone in keeping the true worship. This is the fount of truth. This is the house of faith. This, the temple of God. End quote. Now, you have not heard any one of the post-conciliar claimants to the papacy speaking in such clear ways, right?
No, in the exact opposite. I mean, truly, like it is much more like, yeah, again, all paths lead to God, and they're you're all good in your own. We're not going to try to convert you. Stop going and trying to evangelize. I mean, it's exactly the opposite. Again, it's contradictory. Again, we say it over and over, but I hope people are starting after this whole series. I hope they're starting to kind of see this that we're not just making this up. And you've had You've had about 30 quotes from encyclicals today, and they all contradict this document. Come on, people. How can this be? How can this be?
Yeah, it's stunningly clear.
Yeah.
That this is not a Catholic document. The council cannot be an actual function of the Supreme Magisterium. It's just not possible.
It's interesting. I don't know I think we haven't had a podcast since I saw the video that Father Zepeda on Catholic Wire put out of they did an interview with the man who took part in or even organized the consecrations by Archbishop Took back in the early 1980s. And just interesting, at the very end, there was a point where they read out part of, I don't know, Archbishop Took's memoir or something. And he was saying what he saw at Vatican II was a lot of men who didn't understand Latin as they should. And he said they didn't understand the Latin. And during the lunch or whatever, they would go to the cafes and they'd drink wine and drink coffee. And pretty much, I think his interpretation was like, they just didn't really care. It was just kind of like, yeah, the Pope will handle it. It's fine. We're not even going to watch it. And it's just interesting because you and I have kind of pondered that, like, how did this happen? And someone had an answer. He said, they didn't really understand it. They weren't trained well enough, perhaps, and they didn't care. And it's just interesting that was kind of his words that was again from Took.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's a dereliction of duty on their part,
Yeah.
as opposed to, actively participating in revolution.
Right.
A distinction is to be made. And John the 23rd, ironically, he put out a document insisting upon Latin being the foundation of seminary formation, because he recognized the lack of understanding and proficiency in Latin that
Interesting.
existed in the church at that time.
Hmm.
So that's a great point.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of
fascinating.
sense. The Declaration on Religious Freedom continues by saying this, quote, "The Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. This right of the person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law, whereby society is governed, and thus it is to become a civil right." End quote. Now, there's a whole lot to unpack here. Let's start with the fact that in Libertas, remember, Leo XIII tells us that man's liberty imparts to him a unique dignity. And as I mentioned early on, the Council claims that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person. In other words, according to the way the Council's putting forth their ideas, it's as if human dignity is the source of man's liberty. But recall we said that if the Council really is guilty of treating human dignity as if it's the cause of man's freedom, then we should find that its teaching on man's supposed right to religious liberty overshadows man's duty to render unto God what he is due. Well, I've got bad news for you, or probably, I guess, predictable news. It's actually worse than that. The Council not only invites that kind of a reading, it actually states that man is, quote, "bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. They are also bound to adhere to the truth once it is known," end quote. Now, this is true, but then the Council has the audacity to then declare, quote, "The right to religious freedom has its foundation not in the subjective disposition of the person, but in his very nature. In consequence, the right to this immunity from the power of the state continues to exist even in those who do not live up to their obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it. And the exercise of this right is not to be impeded, provided that just public order is observed," end quote. So what we just saw there is the Council is divorcing man's duty toward Almighty God from his supposed right to religious freedom. It's saying even when man neglects his duty, he still has the right. But in Catholic moral theology, rights and duties always go together, always. Our duty under the eternal law is the sole standard of man's innate rights. But the Council clearly supposes that man continues to have these rights apart from his obligations. Now, there's a lot here that you could call a red flag in this document, but this alone is enough to tell us that Dignitatis Humanae is not a Catholic document. It's not. Any alleged natural right that does not have a corresponding duty to God, the God from whom all rights come, well, obviously it's not Catholic, because you remove the corresponding duties from the equation and you have no right at all. What the Council is saying is that even those who are so evil as to know that Jesus Christ is true God, and to know that the Holy Catholic Church is the one true church, and yet choose instead to serve the evil one, whether it's by Satanism explicitly or even more surreptitiously by practicing false religion and luring naive people away from God via that religion, even they have the natural right to do so unimpeded, according to the Council. It's utterly mind-blowing that they would put forth such a proposition. I want you to note, however, that when the Council insists that the civil right to religious freedom is to be recognized in constitutional law, it's not saying that this right is absolute. Rather, it says that this right is to be recognized, quote, "provided that just public order is observed," end quote. Now, again, we discussed with regard to the notion of due limits, one is moved to ask, insofar as the Council's teaching on religious liberty is concerned, who gets to decide what constitutes just public order? Well, the answer in this case is the same. It's not the Church. The Council doesn't assert any such right. And so what is left? It's the state. It's up to the state to determine what just public order is. But recall what Pope Pius XI taught about just public order. He told us that it can only be realized when and where the kingship of our Lord Jesus Christ is recognized. The Council, by contrast, It speaks as if Christ the King gives men the right and the liberty to make war against him, against his kingdom on earth, the church, and to lead others to rebel against him and his church, just as the false religions do. So while the council, by its lack of Catholic conviction, essentially grants to the state the right to determine what just public order entails, at the same time it demands that the state grant a broad right to religious freedom, even to the false religions, and in this way guaranteeing that just public order will always be lacking.
So it's kind of like Catholic libertarianism. It's sorry, this is my brain's kind of connecting it with it. And the more you talk about this, the more it's like, and I really found this in politics as well, that the more you actually kind of delve into libertarianism, as I understand it, it's like, wait, what? I mean, exactly. Who determines whose rights? I mean, it's like, what is this based on? Based on whose rules? I mean, so it's not the government's, it's not the church, it's mine and yours, and it's really such a it's mess. It's really anarchy, right? In the end, which again, which is incredible that the Catholic Church is promoting, libertarianism and anarchy, really.
Yeah, it's a great observation. It's the divorcing of rights from duties. And the only duty that a libertarian might add is, well, if it doesn't harm somebody else's right to do whatever they please. I mean, at best, it's an earthbound system that is totally separated from the natural law, the eternal law. In Catholic thought, the false religions have no rights. Now, that might sound mean to say, look, no one has the right to be a Muslim. Nobody has the right to be a self-identified Jew in our day. But that's the truth. Those who practice the false religions, even if while being sincerely mistaken, they're not exercising liberty, not authentically. No, they're misusing the high natural endowment of liberty. Now, viewers have no doubt heard the maxim, error has no rights. Okay, and this includes, of course, religious error and false religions more broadly. As Leo XIII writes in Libertas, quote, "It is contrary to reason that error and truth should have equal rights," end quote. So again, what you said at the beginning, Kevin, a lot of this is common sense. The Holy Father Leo XIII is saying the same thing. The idea that error and truth should have the same rights, well, this is just illogical. Reason alone should tell you that that's not the case. Now, does this mean, traditionally speaking, that the state always has an obligation to crack down on the false religions, even in public? Well, the answer is no. Again, from Libertas, the Holy Father writes, quote, "While not conceding any right to anything save for what is true and honest, the Church does not forbid public authority to tolerate what is at variance with truth and justice, for the sake of avoiding some greater evil or of obtaining or preserving some greater good," end quote. So what's being said here is the Church does not concede any right to anything other than what is true. In other words, there's no right freely to practice a false religion. But even so, the Holy Father makes plain it's legitimate, and it sometimes is necessary for the state to tolerate the public expression of a false religion. For example, an evangelical crusade is coming into town in a public venue. And even though it leads people away from the solitary ark of salvation, it might well be that allowing this thing to happen better serves the common good than cracking down on it, and arresting the organizers. It kind of makes sense. It's a prudent judgment that belongs rightly to those who have the authority to govern. And we can say that because all authority to govern comes from God. Everything has to relate back to him as the source. Otherwise, we get lost in the weeds. At the same time, the Church is also plain in teaching that it's perfectly legitimate for the state to curtail certain false religious activities. For example, like Muslim clerics going into the town square and calling naive young men to join their cause to establish Sharia law. Like if that happened in downtown Baltimore, and it happens in places all over the U.S., the government here wouldn't dare step in and crack down on that event. And if it did, the Church would condemn it. The Church, not the Catholic Church, the Conciliar Church would immediately condemn it. But it's within the rights, in fact, even the duties of the state at times, to curtail certain religious activities other than the Catholics. The Holy Father is also clear that while tolerance is sometimes useful and sometimes even necessary, this does not alleviate the state of its duty to offer homage to God and to publicly recognize him. The Holy Father states, quote, "To judge aright, we must acknowledge that the more a state is driven to tolerate evil, the further is it from perfection." So I think at this point, Kevin, I've probably given viewers more than enough to ponder. And there's so much more to cover that I think we should stop here and pick it up again in the next episode. And we'll have plenty to talk about there too. You know, in the next episode, we're going to talk about whether or not Vatican II really is an exercise of the supreme magisterium. And if it is, are we really justified in rejecting the Declaration on Religious Freedom out of hand, even though it so clearly is at odds with what the church has always taught? And then I want to ask the question and address the question, is Dignitatis Humanae binding? In other words, does it claim to be binding on Catholics? And I think the answer is going to surprise a lot of viewers when we really get down into the exact language used by the council, whether or not this thing is binding, or whether those who really believe it was an exercise of the supreme magisterium are justified in saying, well, it's not infallible and I don't have to believe it. Don't be so sure. We'll find out next week.
Oh, okay. I'm excited for that one because that is such a common question you see on X or whatever. You know, that wasn't infallible. It's not ex cathedra, et cetera. So I'm excited for that one because I think it's a very common point about Vatican II. We don't really care. I mean, I think a couple weeks ago you had this whole panel of semi-trads, you know, whatever you want to call them, these R&R guys get together, and I think basically that's what they kind of eventually said. It's like, yeah, it's really bad. It's really bad, but doesn't really matter. You know, it's fine. We don't. It was just a pastoral thing. So I'm glad we'll talk about that because I think that's a really important part of this entire issue. That as I've thought the same, I don't think it's quite that simple. But as always, Louie, wonderful job. Really, really good stuff. As you said, a lot of information. My brain is kind of exploding, a little full now, so, but in a good way, in the best of ways. I appreciate the work you do. I can just tell, you know, with this type of a show, you put a lot of time and effort into this. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for bringing truth to this, because I think it's important that we the clarity that can come from where does this all stem from? What is happening? Why are they doing this? Why are our states like this? Why is Rome like this? And I think it's so much kind of comes together. It makes a lot of sense. So again, thank you for that. Check him out at akacatholic.com. I don't know if he's had any time to write anything because he's doing all the work for the Catholic Family Podcast, which again, we appreciate. But go check out akacatholic.com. In the meantime, check out the rest of this series on Catholic Family Podcast. You can find it in a playlist. And we will see you hopefully next week. We'll see. Sometimes, you know, life gets in the way, but we will plan on next week and for part 2 of Dignitatis Humanae. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, all of that stuff. And we will see you guys next time. Louie, as always, thank you.